for joining us. I'm Diane Rehm. Within a few hours, if not minutes, we should know the fate of General Stanley McCrystal, the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan. Impertinent remarks attributed to the general and his close aides about some in the White House and senior diplomats could cost him his job. Joining me in the studio to discuss General McChrystal's comments, reaction by the administration, and what could be the next step in America's longest war, retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution, and the National Journal's James Kitfield. Do join us. I'll be interested in your reactions as well. 800-433-8850. Send us your email to drshow@wamu.org. Join us on Twitter or Facebook. Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for being here.
Hi, good morning.
Someone said to me just before I went on the air, if my son or daughter were there in Afghanistan and had heard these comments and heard the way top brass is talking, I would be horrified for my youngster if that person, my son or daughter, were there in Afghanistan. What's your reaction, Michael?
Diane, my reaction is complex. I think we do need to, frankly, get a pulse of the troops. My guess, however, even though there are these disputes about the restraint on the use of force that came out in the article as well, that General McChrystal is generally admired. He certainly is very admired among most of the broader leadership in Afghanistan, both international and Afghan. And I think his problems are primarily in Washington. Now, they're very serious problems, and it's his fault that this happened, and it's a quite grave set of offenses. Having said all of that, if you do want to focus on Afghanistan, my overall impression, without overclaiming from my relatively short trips there, is that his standing there is much, much better, and he's much more respected there than he's made himself here.
Colonel Macgregor, we've all heard or read these comments. Do they, in your view, rise to the level of insubordination?
Well, they certainly meet the requirement for relief based on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, because he's made very disparaging remarks about the president, the vice president, the national security advisor. The regulations are very clear about that. If you make disparaging remarks about those people in the chain of command, then you can be removed pending court-martial. So, frankly, the president doesn't have much choice, in my judgment. He has to remove him. What I thought were interesting about his remarks, though, setting aside the inappropriateness of them, was a sense that Stan McChrystal has discovered that he's on a fool's errand, that these objectives are unattainable. These are things that, by the way, he did not develop. This report and its recommendations were not his invention. Those things were conceived by people working for Petraeus and handed to him, and then he sallied forth to do the job, and I think he's discovered it won't work. And that's part of the frustration that he expresses in his comments.
James Kitfield, as a journalist watching all of this, reading the reports, what's your reaction?
I'm kind of flabbergasted that we have a four-star general here. You mentioned the point that, if someone's son or daughter is serving there, and this would be demoralizing, which is why you don't let these things become public, even if you feel them. And it gets to Doug's point. I mean, by actually voicing them in front of a reporter, I don't know if it rises to the level of insubordination, but it certainly rises to the level where that decision is in someone else's hands. President Obama will make this decision. I disagree with Doug. I think it could go either way. There's other things than just his comments to consider here. Michael pointed to the point. The big picture here is how the war goes, and what happens if he changed leadership horses in midstream here is going to be a big concern of Obama's. But I was just flabbergasted that the guy doesn't have more, just a sort of naivete that was coming out in that Rolling Stone article, which I've been through very closely, where these guys, were out drinking with this reporter, letting their hair down, saying the most sort of kinds of things that's not really aren't that surprising. What's surprising is that they said it in front of a reporter and they said it in front of their boss. I mean, if I was the boss there, you would cut that kind of conversation off because they're putting words in his mouth. So the whole, I sense, and people I've talked to in the story sense that, he comes from really a special forces infantry culture. He spent 5 years in Iraq doing these special forces hunter-killer teams, looking for the top, wanted list in Al-Qaeda. I think he has not adjusted his culture of his command to a much broader strategic command headquarters where you have transparency, you have a lot more reporters hanging around. He doesn't seem to have made that adjustment, and it's surprising for someone who's been around as long as he has.
Apparently, his PR person has already resigned. Is that so?
I think so, and I think probably more of his staff need to resign, some of the people who made these disparaging remarks. If I could say one thing, Diane, and Doug raises it, I know we'll get into it in the course of the hour, I think it's important to go through the specific things that we know McCrystal actually said. For example, the statement about General Jones that he was a clown, that's not something McCrystal said, and the article doesn't imply that it was. There were some things that McCrystal said that he shouldn't have, and I certainly agree with Doug and James on that. But let's go through one by one. He apparently said that the president did not seem well prepared or to recognize who he was and his role very well back in July. Again, that's not a great statement, especially when not balanced with the fact that President Obama devoted a lot of time and attention to this war in the fall. But, frankly, for Obama to come out and not be able to say that to one of his own staff, I think fails to understand how staff work in support of a general. And it's not a horrible comment to say that in that particular meeting, the president did not seem quite as well prepared as he might have. I'm not defending it, but let's distinguish that from statements that verge on insubordination. We got to be very careful and specific here about what McCrystal himself is known to have said versus the overall tone of the article.
And this gets to the point. I think he has been poorly served by his aides. I mean, if you're in, and I've been in that situation, and I'm not sure what the ground rules were. It's very unusual. You have ground rules of just a background where you can actually attribute quotes from a drunken party where they're criticizing the civilian chain of command, and you can actually quote them directly and just say one of his close aides, or in some cases the aides were putting words in his mouth. He himself said he felt betrayed by the U.S. ambassador, Carl Eikenberry. He himself apparently said that he thought that Obama was intimidated by the military in one of their meetings. It created a culture that allowed this to go on, and that was a big mistake. Now, again, does it rise to insubordination? I mean, one thing I was struck by this article is, and Michael's right, a lot of it is non-attributable aides who said things in kind of a drunken party at an Irish pub. And I've never seen that before, and that's kind of interesting that it was reported in such depth. It was allowed to be reported. They haven't questioned the reporter's ground rules, so I assume they are sort of admitting that this went on. But it's very unusual that happened.
Listen, I think the listeners should understand that most of the reporters that these 4 stars have been dealing with since 2001 fall into a couple of categories. First, you've got lots of reporters who are ideologically aligned with the long war. In other words, they're supportive of what we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they're going to hear these things, but they're not going to report them. Then you have people that want to cultivate access so that they can write books and make money. And they write, together with their ideological counterparts, lots of puff pieces. I think this 4-star assumed, Stan McCrystal assumed, that this was going to be another puff piece, glorifying him and exalting him the way we have done that with all of the 4 stars for the last several years. And so nobody bothered to say, listen, this is on background, this is off the record, this is on the record. They didn't bother following those rules because they weren't worried.
It's interesting because Michael Hastings, the writer in Rolling Stone, was only supposed to spend, one day with the general, but because of the volcano, the ash from the volcano ended up spending a month. Now, did that create a different